Hello, my name is John Quinn, and when I was asked to give a presentation for the Medical Library Club at Wakanda, it was obvious to me that the subject I should talk about is the history of anesthesia. I read a tremendous lot as a resident, and the first chapter of any textbook is the history of anesthesia or the scope of anesthesia, something of that nature. And I've been out to the Ether Dome a couple times, and I'm an amateur history buff on my own. And as for the audience, I thought that, a group like this is to have be pretty well-rounded, and rather than just talking about policy or, for that matter, science, I think history tells us where we are and has a lot of value. Again, I've called this lecture the history of anesthesia, but really what we're talking about today is the advent of anesthesia at the Ether Dome in 1846 and the events surrounding that. But I just want to point out that anesthesia has a very rich history, and if there's an interest in me giving a part two to this talk, I could tailor it well for this audience. And just a few highlights. Throughout history, cocaine, for example, is the first local anesthetic employed in the 1880s. Procedures such as epidurals and spinals around the turn of the century. A lot of these advances came about after wartime. Airway equipment and CO2 absorption, for example, after World War I, barbiturates such as sodium pentothal in the 30s, muscle relaxants like succinylcholine and curare in the 40s, and fluorine technology came out of World War II, and that led to halothane and the non-explosive ethers in the 50s. And more recently, improvements in monitoring such as capnography and oximetry and airway equipment and subspecialization and et cetera. But again, tonight we're talking about the advent of anesthesia. I've broken this talk into three sections. In the first section, we're going to talk about prior to the 1840s, and there's two main drugs we're talking about. It's ether, sulfuric ether, and nitrous oxide. We're going to talk about where these drugs came from and what their uses were prior to anesthesia. Before we leave that first section, I'd like to try to put you in the shoes of what it was like to these people in the 1840s. We only know the world since the advent of anesthesia, but I've got some quotes and anecdotes from various people in the 1830s and 40s to show you that this was just a big deal, really a moment in history. The second section is entitled 1844 to 1846. In that section, there's three main characters we're going to be talking about: William Morton, Horace Wells, and Charles Jackson. I've known this story well for about 20 years, but it wasn't until I was preparing this the last couple months that I realized just how intertwined their three lives were for several years leading up to this event in October of 1846, Ether Day. They knew each other quite well and were acquainted for 3 or 4 years. And then in the third section, it's the aftermath. There became what was known as the ether controversy that in many ways still isn't settled today. And we'll talk about their subsequent lives. Really, they all led tragic lives after this event. And then I'd like to close with a summary. Section 1, prior to the 1840s. Again, there's two drugs, ether and nitrous oxide, we're talking about. There's reports of ether going back to medieval times with alchemists, and even prior to that in the 8th and 9th century in Saudi Arabia. But certainly by 1540, there's reports. There's a Swiss physician during the Renaissance by the name of Paracelsus. He scores 3 paragraphs in my old world book. He did a lot of things in Renaissance medicine. But he added ether to chicken feed, and he made the observation that, and besides, it has associated with it such sweetness that it is taken even by chickens, and they fall asleep from it for a while, but awaken later without harm. There's a recurring theme during this first section of people not quite making the association, which is obvious today, that you inhale these substances and you're asleep and insensible, and a surgeon can fix you with a scalpel and you awaken painlessly and without harm. And Paracelsus said that because of this characteristic, it might be useful in painful illnesses, and then a contemporary of his uses it for whooping cough. In the next century, Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle. Boyle's famous for his studies of gases and pressure and volume, etc., Boyle's laws. They were both aware of ether, but neither had sustained interest in it. And then in the 1760s, it begins entering medical use. There's a letter from a physician in England, and he's writing a doctor friend of his, and excuse me, it's an English physician, and he's writing his doctor friend in New England, and they had been talking about venereal disease. And then he says, and now to the medicines in vogue. The next to this is a medicine called ether. They go so far as to give it internally for all pains and complaints, but I fear it does more harm than good. So again, people were making the observation that the ether causes a state of lethargy. It had some effect on the spinal system. One man made the comment that if the air be too strongly impregnated with ether, stupefaction ensues. But again, the association between these drugs and their use in surgery and anesthesia had not been made. Our second drug is nitrous oxide. Nitrous is synthesized in 1773 by just an amazing Englishman by the name of Joseph Priestley. I was watching Book TV last spring, and there's a new biography. There's a lot of biographies out on Priestley, but I saw the author interviewed. Just an amazing man during the Age of Reason. He reminds me of Jefferson and Ben Franklin in our country. He wore so many different hats. Priestley's a historian, he's a clergyman, theologian. He's one of the founders of the Unitarian Church. But Priestley mostly goes down in history as being a pioneering chemist. And in 1772-73, just within 6 months, Priestley synthesizes, identifies, describes oxygen and nitrous oxide. And if for no other reason, Joseph Priestley deserves a part in this story because they're the only two pure gases still used routinely, daily, by people like me in the operating room. At this time in the late 1700s, respiratory illnesses were becoming a major cause of disease in Europe, and in some countries it's actually the leading cause of death. And in England, in 1798, there's formed the Pneumatic Institution, and this sounds to me just exactly like New Age medicine today, you know, hydrotherapy and taking outside substances to cure some unrelated thing. And the idea at the Pneumatic Institute, there was people would inhale different gases to fix a variety of problems. Who do they hire to be the first superintendent of this institution? But Humphrey Davy, and I've heard of Humphrey Davy in other stories. He later goes on to be knighted, and he's wildly famous, just idolized by the commoners. He's known for his experiments and for his lectures. Again, this is well before radio and television. And there were great orders, and Davy was one of them. And he's picked to be the first head of this Pneumatic Institute. And what gas does he focus most of his attention on but nitrous oxide? And if you can believe it, in the year 1800, Davy publishes a 580-page text on nitrous oxide. And this text has become famous for some just huge understatements that were made in it. He makes the observation that if you've got a severe headache, you inhale nitrous, it makes the headache better, and if you've got a mild headache, it gets rid of it. And same thing for a toothache. And but the most famous quote in this 580-page text is, "As nitrous oxide in its extensive operation appears capable of destroying pain, it may probably be used with advantage during surgical operations." One author said that while he was later knighted and idolized by everyone, the wisest thing he ever said, that quote, was ignored. And he's a basic researcher. He's not a physician. He's not a surgeon. And he had some friends that would come over. They were aware that you'd get kind of inebriated, a buzz, so to speak, if you'd inhale nitrous oxide. He had some famous friends, some poets, and Robert Roget, who later became famous for Roget's Thesaurus, was one of these people. They'd come over to the Pneumatic Institution, and they'd inhale these nitrous oxide. And that, in fact, is the use of nitrous oxide and ether over the next 40 years, from 1800 until the 1840s, leading up to Ether Day. It's a form of entertainment, especially in college towns. In those towns, they had the laboratories to synthesize these gases. Nitrous oxide's a little tricky to compose. And also there you had the college kids who were willing to inhale these gas. And you know, it might be that you went to a party on a Friday night and someone would have a bag of nitrous oxide, and you'd inhale it and get a high, and the next night you'd go to a party and someone would have a flask of ether and you'd inhale the fumes. And these were called nitrous follies and ether frolics, and a form of entertainment over that 40-year window between Davy's book and 1800 and to the 1840s. There's two major exceptions during this window. One is Dr. Crawford Long. He's a physician in rural Georgia that we're going to talk about just really briefly in this talk in section 3. The other exception is Henry Hickman. He's an Englishman. He lives only during this window. His dates are from 1800 to 1830. And Henry Hickman, in 1823, there's different authors give credit for who gets the most credit for this discovery of anesthesia. There's one author that puts Henry Hickman right at the top of the list because he was searching intentionally to find an inhaled anesthetic to relieve the pain of surgery. That's the concept we're looking for that no one had made yet and had come up with yet. And Henry Hickman, the problem was he was using the wrong drug, the wrong gas. He was using carbon dioxide, CO2. And he did experiments on animals, and carbon dioxide does have some anesthetic value. He'd anesthetize these animals, and he'd make a surgical incision, and there'd be no response, and they'd reawaken. But again, it has limited value. To me, it would make patients acidotic inhaling CO2. But the problem is he simply had the wrong gas. And you've got to wonder, where was Sir Humphrey Davy at this time? He's still living, I believe, until 1829. And if he could have directed young Henry Hickman to use nitrous oxide rather than carbon dioxide, this may have gone down as an English innovation rather than what many people still consider today the greatest contribution America's had to the history of medicine. I mentioned that before we leave this section, I'd like to kind of put you in the shoes of what it was like to these people when this innovation came about in 1846. It was just thought impossible to these people that pain could be separated from surgery. Simply inconceivable. The most noted French surgeon at the time, Alfred Velpeau, in 1839, just 7 years prior to Ether Day, he said, "To escape pain in surgical operations is a chimera which we are not permitted to look for in our day. Knife and pain in surgery are two words which never present themselves the one without the other in the minds of patients, and it is necessary for us surgeons to admit their association." Again, just inconceivable. The analogy would be to these people in the 1840s, if you told them in 50 or 60 years we'd be flying like a bird, and not very long after that, we'd be flying through the air faster than sound travels through the air. And then after that, we're going to the moon. And then after that, we're making plans to go to Mars. They just simply wouldn't be able to get their mind around it. And also, anesthesia is kind of considered as a joke sometimes. In the movies, they talk about bite the bullet and give them a pint of gin. I was in southern England in this military tunnel a couple months ago in August of this year, 2010. And I was taking a tour of this, and it was where Churchill used to go. In one of the rooms, they simulated an operating room, and over the loudspeaker, they had a man moaning in pain, and one man in the tour started to laugh. And I guess in a way I understand that, but there was nothing funny about this. And what was it like if you were going to have an operation? If you were told you were going to have surgery, many people would run away from home. Most surgeons, a majority of surgeons, knew someone who had committed suicide. Many people would choose to die by their own hand or to die from the disease rather than to have an operation. On this very date in October 1846, if say you were led into a room like this, the first thing you would notice on the floor was sawdust around the table. These were fast, bloody operations, and the sawdust aided in cleaning things up afterwards. And I was always told these operating rooms, like at Methodist, were up on the top floor. because there were less microbes, less germs. Really, that's not till later on. Lister and germ theory is not till the 1880s or thereabout. The ether dome, for example, was indeed a dome and allowed light in, but these rooms were isolated up on the top floor and they were far away from the rest of the hospital, so the screams would be separate from the rest of the hospital. You might be brought up to the operating room on a dumbwaiter. This was to limit traffic. There might be 6 or 8 orderlies that might be bringing you up there to hold you down. As you approach the table, the first thing you'd notice, you'd see a surgeon. He might have on a long old winter coat, but it would be caked with blood and tissue. And this was considered a badge of experience and good for you. And perhaps just opposite of today, he would have in his hand a scalpel, and the handle would be clean, but then the blade would be caked with blood from prior operations. If you'd been in the ether dome on this very morning in October of 1846 and you were a student or someone out in the audience, on that very morning there were hooks and pulleys and ropes and rings and things to restrain the patient. There was an English physician by the name of Cooper. He related this anecdote about his uncle, who was a surgeon, and he said he was going to amputate a man's leg when the poor fellow, terrified at the array of instruments and appliances, suddenly jumped off the table and bolted off, seeing which the operator, instead of following the man and attempting to persuade him to the evil which circumstances rendered necessary, turned round and said, apparently much relieved by his departure, "By God, I'm glad he's gone." The surgeon glad that the patient's leaving. John Struthers was one of the most noted Scottish surgeons. He said, "The operator theater ringing with the groans and shrieks of the patient, the distressed faces of the crowd of students, and the haste of the operator to be done." Obviously, this was difficult on the patients, and in one of my textbooks I used in the bibliography, there's a several paragraph description of what this was like to undergo surgery awake. Just briefly, he talks about the blank whirlwind of emotion during the operation. Difficult on the audience, the students. There was a student in Scotland who witnessed a mastectomy, quit medical school, wanted nothing to do with medicine thereafter. And an ancient Greek philosopher once said that pitilessness is an essential and good characteristic of a surgeon. One of the few heroes in our story here is the surgeon in this portrait, Dr. John C. Warren. He's the head of surgery at Massachusetts General. And he said, "What surgeon is there who has not felt, while witnessing the distress of long painful operations, a sinking of the heart to which no habit could render himself insensible? What surgeon has not at these times been inspired with a wish to find some means of lessening the sufferings he was obliged to inflict?" This was a big deal. Section 2, 1844 to 1846, the advent of anesthesia. I've got a disclaimer before this section. There's a lot of material, and I wanted to keep each of the sections to less than 20 minutes. But I give some background information in the previous lives on these people that I feel is important to the rest of the story. And I have references. This is one of those stories where if you grab 5 books on this, 3 books will agree and have the same version, the other 2 will have their own version. You look up some other aspect of the story, 4 textbooks will agree and the other one will disagree. And but this is the story as I know it, and my references are attached. Our first player is Dr. William Morton. He's born in 1819 in rural Massachusetts, Charlton, Massachusetts. These are all New Englanders, by the way. He's born in 1819, so he's just in his early to middle 20s during all these events in the 1840s. It's funny how these people, their personalities all kind of resemble their portraits. He's always described as kind of a dashing and charming person, a people person, and tall and well-dressed and good-looking guy. He has a tough upbringing, and I made some notes of just really could be considered a dossier of this man from ages 17 to 21. And it's really quite a remarkable 4 years he had. He quit school at age 17 and he goes to work for the local tavern, and he ends up getting in trouble for embezzling. The sheriff tells him to leave town. A few other points. He then moves on to Rochester. He gets in this partnership for a haberdashery. There's a $5,000 loan of credit, which isn't accounted for. He gets kicked out of the local church for dishonesty. He then moves on to Cincinnati. There's a $6,500 loan of credit, which isn't answered to. The only operation that we know that Dr. Morton had in his lifetime was a circumcision, and that was in preparation. There was a well-to-do rich Jewish girl. In most of these cities, he gets engaged to well-to-do young women, and he undergoes a circumcision. He got caught in a swindle with U.S. mail seals, and he was dating these envelopes, post-dating them or putting the wrong city on them and things. He gets caught in the swindle there, and then he flees the fiancée, and he doesn't pay the doctor. From Cincinnati, he moves on to St. Louis. There he gets engaged again, and there's a letter of recommendation. It's kind of a convoluted story. He ends up down in New Orleans, and they're loading this ship up with goods, and they catch him at the last minute. He returns to St. Louis. There's another rich fiancée, and there's some incident with firearms, and he's told to leave town within 24 hours. There's a couple minor financial skirmishes, so to speak, in Baltimore and Washington, but then in the early 1840s, he ends up back in New England. He had gotten a small inheritance and returned home. And perhaps we could call that 4-year period kind of youthful indiscretion, except if it were not for some of the later events. However, there he meets Dr. Horace Wells, who's just a few years senior to him. Who is Dr. Wells? He's a well-respected dentist in Hartford, Connecticut. In fact, he's the dentist to the governor of Connecticut in Hartford, the capital. And I'm quite sympathetic with Dr. Wells. He's a religious person. He's never interested in money throughout this story. There was a letter he wrote to his family a few years prior to these events where he said, "It is my sincere desire to do as much good as possible, and I hope and pray that no selfish motive may ever influence me to go contrary to this principle." A friend of his in Hartford had said that he was very sensitive to criticism and of encouragement. That he got a lot of, and that he could not view others as dishonest. He seems like rather an innocent, you may see later in this story. Also important to this story, he's an inventive individual. He has a patent for a coal screen, and in the early 1840s, he's working on this this process for gold dental bridge work, and another invention. So these two meet, Morton and Wells, Morton decides to go into dentistry. And it wasn't like now with dental schools and that. You did an apprenticeship with a dentist. And so they spent, I imagine, a period of months together in 1842 with Morton the trainee and Wells training Morton. And at the end of that training, Dr. Wells helps Dr. Morton set up a practice in a suburb of Hartford. So they're both practicing in Hartford, Connecticut. The following summer, in 1843, these two go into a partnership together, Morton and Wells. And it had to do with that gold bridge work that I just mentioned. And their plan was Wells would stay in Hartford and Morton would move 100 miles down the road to Boston, Massachusetts. And that way they'd have two major cities covered. And neither of them really knew anybody in Boston. And it wasn't like FDA approval, but you needed an endorsement, a general opinion of this new product in order to market it. And so these two dentists, these two young dentists, end up in the office of Dr. Charles Jackson in October of 1843. Charles Jackson is a very respected chemist in Boston, and he's also a surveyor during this period of expansion. Who's Dr. Jackson? Again, he's just considered brilliant. He's separate from Harvard, but he's got this most advanced chemistry laboratory. As a child, he was rather sickly. He had an interest in geology and chemistry to the point where they had to dissuade him from studying science so much. He's from a very prominent family. It wasn't the Mayflower, but it was a boat not very long after that. So a very well-established Boston family, well-to-do family with some money. He goes to Harvard Medical School, and he's in the class of 1829. And after medical school, he goes to Europe, and he finishes education in Paris. And that's important to this story because, as I've just described, you've got this kind of upper crust Bostonian, and he's very formally trained, and also he knows the way of European medicine and European science, and which is different from here in America, where it's more of an entrepreneurship. So these three have met 3 years prior to Ether Day. This is October of 1843, and Morton and Wells spend 3 days in Boston, and I believe for a $20 fee, Jackson approves of this gold plating. And so Morton stays in Boston, Wells heads back down to Hartford. The partnership between Morton and Wells, however, falls through about a month later. And it ends up that Dr. Morton had kept the seed money for this partnership, so perhaps his old ways weren't quite behind him. And but he stays in Boston. He had gotten engaged again, and the parents didn't think much of dentistry, but they said, if you're studying to become a physician, we'll allow you to marry our daughter. And Morton got closer to the Boston scientific, the medical establishment, and he knew Jackson. And so 6 months later, after meeting him in October of 43, it's now the spring of 44, Jackson actually becomes the tutor to young Dr. Morton, and Jackson is his landlord for a period of time. Dr. Wells, as we've said, has returned down to Hartford, Connecticut, and his dental practice life's continued on as it had before. Lyceums, lectures were a big thing at this time. Again, it's really 100 years, before radio and television, but it would be that a great lecturer, personality like Oliver Wendell Holmes or Ralph Waldo Emerson would come to your town, and everybody would meet down at the Opera House or auditorium, and that would be an evening's education and entertainment to hear a great lecture. And in fact, in the summer of 1844, Horace Wells and his wife went to a lecture in Hartford on mesmerism, hypnotism, which is in some sort related to our history of anesthesia, I guess. But on December 10th of 1844, who comes to Hartford but a showman by the name of Gardner Colton, and he's giving a demonstration of nitrous oxide. And Dr. Wells and his wife are in attendance that night. And again, this is probably billed as being educational, and Mr. Colton probably talked about the history of nitrous like I have, and some of the chemistry. And but then at the end of the show, I think it was largely entertainment. He'd have perhaps a dozen volunteers come on stage. Horace Wells volunteers to come on stage, and his wife entered in her diary that he made a fool of himself. We don't know exactly what he did, but the most common version of this story is he's recovering from the effects of nitrous oxide. He's sitting on the bench at the back of the stage, and there's a man sitting next to him who had injured his leg while he had been inebriated from nitrous, and he's cut his knee and he's bleeding, and but he's laughing. And if anybody deserves credit for a moment of brilliance and for a light bulb going off over their head in this story, perhaps it's Horace Wells, because he goes up to Colton after the show and he says, this man cut his leg and he was laughing through it. Why can't I use this gas, nitrous oxide, in my dental practice? And Colton Gardner says, well, you could. And the next day, December 11th, 1844, they all congregate in Wells's dental office. Colton's there, and in the spirit of science, Wells inhales the gas on himself, and a partner of his, Dr. Riggs, who actually became famous in dentistry, he pulls the tooth, and this is a huge success. And Wells is very open about this, and he's telling all the other dentists in Hartford about nitrous oxide and dental analgesia. And There's actually a physician in Hartford published that the dentists in Hartford were using nitrous oxide in dentistry, so he does later on have a case of priority with this innovation. But about a month later, with only 5 weeks experience, Horace Wells believes he has a surgical painkiller, and he takes this up to Boston, and he looks up his old acquaintances, Dr. Morton and Dr. Jackson, and he later claims that neither of them had any concept of this idea of inhalational analgesia, and he said that Jackson in particular scoffed at the idea of using nitrous oxide as an anesthetic. Morton, as I said, has become more familiar, acquainted with the medical staff and the establishment around Boston, and he goes to Dr. John C. Warren, who's the head of surgery at Massachusetts General at Harvard. Let me tell you a little about Dr. Warren. Who is he? This is a man who's at the end of his career. He's now in his late 60s, and it's been said that he'd spend his whole career probably telling every medical class he ever had that we need a surgical painkiller. He's a surgeon. He had been one of the founders of Massachusetts General decades earlier, I believe in 1811 or 1812. It's a medical legacy at Harvard. His dad was a doctor from Harvard, and his dad was one of the founders of the Harvard Medical School, but the most beloved Warren was actually the uncle of J.C. Warren. He was a physician as well, and he quit his practice for the Revolutionary cause and lost his life in the Revolutionary War, and again, he was just beloved by Bostonians. So it's a very well-established family, and Warren is at the end of his career and completely entrusted and respected. So Dr. Warren allows for Wells to bring the surgical painkiller into Harvard, the halls of Harvard, and that occurs on January 20th, 1845. This becomes known as the Humbug Affair. This is a failure, and they don't know if it was because Wells had a bad batch, of nitrous oxide, or if his patient was uncooperative. They were actually going to do an amputation with nitrous oxide, and thankfully they didn't. Nitrous is a wonderful drug, but it's not very potent, and as a sole anesthetic, it simply wouldn't work for an amputation. But that operation fell through for some reason, and they had a student from the audience volunteer to have a tooth pulled under the effects of nitrous oxide. And again, this doesn't work out. You can just imagine that Wells pulls the tooth in public on the stage at Harvard, and the patient yells out, and the students are laughing, and they're yelling, "Humbug, humbug." I still don't know what humbug means, but I don't think it means anything good. Charles Dickens's Christmas Carol came out just the Christmas before this, a year, 13 months ahead of this in 43. And there, of course, Scrooge is always saying, "Bah, humbug, bah, humbug." But this humbug affair, again, Wells is kind of a sensitive young man. He was affected quite deeply by this. In fact, he soon abandons his dental practice after this public failure with nitrous oxide. Morton, by all accounts, was present there that day for the humbug affair, and he had loaned Wells his dental instruments. And the next morning after this event, Wells simply left Morton's instruments at his doorstep and didn't say goodbye, and he went back down to Hartford. You can also imagine that spring up in Boston, everyone's saying, "Oh, that dentist from Connecticut, thinking he had a painkiller and making fun of him, calling him a humbug." Well, they all called him a humbug except for one person, and that's Dr. Morton. He knew Dr. Wells, and he knows that Wells is no humbug. He knows he's a very original man, a thinker, and a very competent individual. In that next summer of 1845, Morton goes down to see Wells in Hartford, ostensibly, apparently to pay him back some of that debt he owed him, and also to kind of catch up. They say that Wells always considered Morton a friend, despite some of the partnership failings that they'd had. But while down there also, Morton asks Wells about that nitrous oxide, and that experiment that he had done up in Boston the winter before. And Wells takes him down to his office. Wells had been so discouraged, he actually sold his dental practice after that and got into some completely unrelated things like bird expositions and things. But he went down to his former dental practice and he shows Morton how nitrous oxide is used. Morton does nothing with this for at least a year. And one version of the story is the following summer of 1846, just a few months before Ether Day in October of 1846, he's at this resort between Hartford and Boston, and he meets a woman who was one of Wells's first patients receiving nitrous oxide. And she says, "Oh, it was wonderful. Not only did I not hurt, I actually felt good, and he pulled my tooth, and it was a great success." If this reignites Morton's interest in anesthesia, it does not reignite his interest in looking up Wells in the summer of 1846. In fact, Morton starts becoming quite secretive. He has different of his dental assistants go to different pharmacists around Boston to obtain ether because he doesn't want the pharmacist to start getting suspicious that there's a use of ether in dentistry. And yes, I just mentioned ether, not nitrous oxide. In fact, Morton gave no credit to Wells for this concept of inhalational anesthesia, which is just hard to believe because here he'd known Wells for several years. He'd been trained by Wells. By all accounts, he was there on the day of the humbug affair. But Morton's story officially was that he got the idea from a dental assistant of his who had been at one of these ether frolics, and that a student had been at that party and got insensible, and etc. And Morton put two and two together. But Morton's being quite secretive. He's doing experiments on his farm outside of Boston that summer of 1846. There's some people that wonder just how many experiments he did based on his observations, which didn't seem quite very consistent. And late in that summer, he goes to an instrument maker in Boston. He needs some help on how to give this in human medicine. There's a lot of these instrument makers around Boston. In fact, this story might not have taken place in another city, but there's so many innovations around Harvard and these instrument makers. Well, anyway, this instrument maker says, who you need to talk to is Dr. Jackson. He's the one that can give you the advice about ether and people, human medicine. Now again, Morton's been quite secretive. He thinks he's on the cusp of something great, and he does agree, though. He goes over to see Dr. Jackson on September 30th of 1846. And this later becomes a very important date in the ether controversy. Morton says his story was that he went over and he asked Jackson where his bag of used for nitrous was. And Jackson said, "Oh, it's over there in the corner." And Morton says, you could just have patients inhale this gas, the air, and then they could think, kind of like hypnotism, they could think that they're under the effects of an anesthetic. And Jackson says, well, if you did that, you'd be a bigger fool than Horace Wells was with his nitrous oxide. And Morton looks at Jackson and he says, well, what about ether? And Jackson says, well, you could. Jackson's attorneys later said that the conversation was all over and Morton was leaving with the bag used for nitrous oxide, and he was on the steps of his house and leaving, and Jackson caught up with him and he said, look, we've known each other for some time. Ether's the drug you want to use, not nitrous, and it's a liquid at room temperature, and so you need a flask and you have the patient inhale the vapor. And Jackson said that he gave Morton all the information in minute detail of how to use this as an anesthetic. That's September 30th. Again, we'll never know quite what transpired between these two individuals on that day. But regardless, later that same day, September 30th, Morton, back in his dental office, I believe, uses ether for a dental anesthetic, and it's successful. He pulls the tooth of a friend, And not only that, he has a newspaper man there to witness this dental anesthetic with ether. And so then in early October, the first few opening days of October 1846, Wells is in the newspaper. He's got advertisements. He's advertising painless dental surgery. And I'd imagine there's columns by this newspaper man about him using this wonderful new anesthetic. And not only that, Morton in early October goes to an attorney, a man by the name of Mr. Eddy, E-D-D-Y, and it's not a big part of my presentation, but this became one of the first big medical patent cases. There had been patents for medicine earlier on some of the quackery stuff in the Wild West, but this was the first big significant medical patent case. There's a young physician at Harvard by the last name of Bigelow, and he sees these advertisements for painless dental surgery, and that gets his attention, and he goes to look up Morton, and it's said that he witnesses 20 or 30 dental anesthetics in Morton's office in those first couple weeks of October. And he paves the road for Morton to come back to Harvard. Again, Dr. Warren is still the chief of surgery up at Harvard at Massachusetts General. And a couple days before Friday, October 16th, 1846, Morton gets an invitation to appear at 10 o'clock on that morning. Dr. Warren had wanted to operate for some time on a young painter by the name of Gilbert Abbott. He's 20 years old, and he's got a tumor under his left mandible. It's lymphatic or vascular in origin, and he knows it's going to take some dissection. And it wasn't an emergency or anything, but Warren must have thought this is a good candidate. And so a day or two before this, Morton gets an invitation to appear. 10 o'clock comes that morning. The audience starts to fill up. Same number of students, but the word had gotten around among the faculty, the surgeons, that there might be a new surgical painkiller. So I think it's likely that there were a few more surgeons that morning. At 10 o'clock, Morton's not present, and the orderlies start to strap up young Gilbert Abbott. And Dr. Warren says, no, we've decided to give this man a chance with his anesthetic. And we're going to wait a few minutes. And it said that Dr. Warren, again, he's completely trusted and respected, and that his word is law. And so if he can wait, everyone else agrees to wait very patiently. More time goes by, and about a quarter after, there's still no Morton, but Warren puts himself on the line. And one of the quotes was, there's a gentleman. Warren addresses the audience and says, there's a gentleman who claims he's discovered that the inhalation of a certain agent will produce insensibility to pain during surgical operations with safety to the patient. I have always considered this an important desideratum in operative surgery, and after due consideration, I decided to permit him to try the experiment. More time goes by, and they say that the students in the audience were looking down at these most esteemed, the best surgeons in Massachusetts down in the front, and that those surgeons were looking up at Dr. Warren, and Dr. Warren's looking at his pocket watch. But finally at 10:25, he says, well, it appears as though Mr. Morton's been engaged. And they probably got some snickers for that. And you can just picture this in a Hollywood movie. Warren grabs a scalpel, and Gilbert Abbott looks up, and the audience is on the edge of their seat. And in walks Dr. Morton, instrument maker, at the last second at 10:25, and he's got a new glass inhaler in his hand. It was actually a more complicated piece of glassware that was necessary. It had valves and things in it, and it's thought that he actually had some patent concerns. He wanted to make this an unusual innovation. But Dr. Warren looks at Dr. Morton and probably sarcastically says, "Sir, your patient is ready." And Morton ignores everyone, and he walks up to Gilbert Abbott, and he gives the first pre-anesthetic visit and says, are you ready? Are you nervous? Do you have any questions? And then Gilbert Abbott, for a couple, 3 minutes, inhales ether through this new glass inhaler. And then Dr. Morton looks up at Dr. Warren and says, "Sir, your patient is ready." Warren makes about a 3-inch incision under the left mandible. It's unclear to me whether this took 10 minutes to 20 minutes or whether Morton had to re-administer the gas. But it's a flawless anesthetic and everything goes well. They repeatedly asked Gilbert Abbott afterwards if it hurt. And he said, well, maybe it scratched a little bit at the end, but it certainly was not painful. And Dr. Warren addresses the audience and he very famously proclaims, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." Section 3, the aftermath. What became known as the ether controversy. Well, what happened next after Ether Day? The first thing Warren and the other surgeons up at Harvard wanted to do was they wanted to do this again. And the next morning on Saturday, Morton gives the anesthetic. There's a woman who had a soft tumor removed from her arm. This, like all the other anesthetics that Morton gave that first month, was flawless, just a faultless anesthetic. There's a report in Scientific American that came out on that Saturday, the next day, that must have obviously been pre-printed up and based on some of his dental anesthetics earlier in the month. And Morton's getting a crush of patients. He's in the newspaper. There's more advertisements, you know, and things, and Morton's associated with this event. Dr. Jackson had, he wanted nothing to do with this for at least the first week after Ether Day, October 16th. He hadn't been there on Ether Day in the Ether Dome. He hadn't been in Morton's dental office. They hadn't even talked, all our knowledge, between September 30th and then. And there becomes a wide, deep gulf between Morton and Jackson. And that's, Jackson considered Morton as kind of a vulgar. You know, he's not well trained and he's just doesn't come from the background and things. And he thinks he's kind of a showman and a salesman and things. And so he had nothing to do with this the first week. But on the next Thursday night, October 22nd, Dr. Warren had just started this Thursday evening club. And Jackson's invited to this. It's different people from Harvard. There's physicians from Harvard, some lawyers. There's a businessman in attendance who had given him some money to start up this club. But it's kind of a gentleman's club. In Dr. Warren's diary, he'd been putting together this mastodon skeleton, and so they probably talked about that first. But then you can just imagine him saying, "Oh, by the way, people, last Friday and Saturday we had a person inhale gases, and I was the surgeon on the first one, and it worked great." Well, Jackson had been nowhere in this picture, and then he astounds everybody by speaking up and saying, "That was my idea." And the next day, he goes to Morton and says, "Look, for this great success you've had, you owe me $500 for that advice I gave you back on September 30th. And Morton's reply is, he has his attorney, Mr. Eddy, go back to Jackson, and he says, "Look, we're applying for this patent, and why don't you apply for this patent with us? Morton's to get 65%, I, the attorney, am getting 25%, and you can have 10% of the patent rights." And Jackson agrees to this, and that patent is applied for on the 27th of October. Meanwhile, up at Massachusetts General, it said that everybody knew this was ether, anybody with a nose, and they had more operations to perform at the end of the month, the last 2 days of October. And Dr. Morton had directed some of his underlings to obtain some ether and to put together a glass inhaler. And then he finds out about this patent that's being applied for. And he writes Dr. Morton on the 28th of October, and he says, "I am very anxious to find a mode of mitigating the sufferings of patients under surgical operations. If you can, without impropriety, give me a practical account of the apparatus and the substance employed, or purchase for the hospital this apparatus, it would be a real blessing to humanity and a favor to your friend and servant, J.C. Warren." What was Morton's reply? Nothing. And in Morton's defense, those operations to my knowledge, they took place without anesthetics. And to Morton's defense, I think he knew that this was going to be a great thing for people in medicine and hospitals. But his main interest in this patent and the use of ether was for dental anesthesia. And I saw a write-up where, based on the size of the town and how many dentists were in the town, he would get, say, $200 for the rights for a year, or $400 per year. That same week, Mr. Eddy comes up to Morton and says, look, I'm having a couple problems with this patent. Number one, I don't know if we can patent something as commonplace and something that's as well known as ether. But number two, you need to use this on a real, true capital operation, not these superficial tumors and lipomas and things. And so in early November 1846, Morton goes back to Harvard, Massachusetts General, and says, let me use my drug for an amputation. And Harvard says, no, you're not coming back here till you tell us what this is and what you're using and what you're doing. And they have a standoff between Morton and MGH, Massachusetts General. And finally, though, after a few days, Morton says, yes, this is indeed ether. And he gives Harvard all the rights and tells them how he's doing it and that he can use it for free. Again, as I mentioned, to Morton's credit, his interest mostly was in dental anesthesia. And, but Harvard allows him to come back, and on the 7th of November, there's a young woman who's got an infected leg, and she undergoes an amputation. Again, it's another faultless anesthetic, and this is considered the first surgery under anesthetic where a life was saved, and Morton's received as a conquering hero afterwards and a complete success. The patent is granted just a few days later on November 12th. For history buffs like me and trivia buffs, the Secretary of State that signs that patent is James Buchanan, who just, 10 years later is our last president going into the Civil War. There's some famous people associated with this story. Ralph Waldo Emerson is a part of this story. He's Jackson's brother-in-law, and kind of carries the baton for Jackson later in the ether controversy. Henry David Thoreau plays a small part in this story. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a Bostonian, and it was in this month of November that he suggested the name anesthesia for this new discovery. And if you've heard that the Gettysburg Address, 18 years later, whatever it would be, in 1863, that the man who spoke before Abraham Lincoln spoke for 2 hours, and then Lincoln gets up and in 90 seconds gives the Gettysburg Address. The man who spoke before him was Edward Everett, who was a very respected congressman later on, and but he is actually the president of Harvard at this time, and he was very proud that all these events took place at Harvard while he was president. Other cities in the U.S., New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, they're very slow to pick up on this new anesthetic, this new discovery of anesthesia. In fact, I don't believe it's till the next summer of 1847 that they start to employ anesthetics. They probably think, oh, that ivory tower, Harvard, they know everything. Boston don't care. Boston's looking to Europe. All the great medical inventions were always coming down from Europe to the lowly U.S., and Boston's saying, well, we've got something for Europe this time with this discovery. In fact, in mid-November, the attorney, Mr. Eddy, goes up to Jackson about just a routine patent matter, nothing big. Jackson had been out of town on one of these surveying commissions, and he gets back, and again, there'd been this big success with the anesthetic and the amputation a few days earlier. He pretty much blows up in front of Eddy, and he says, look, we both know this was entirely my idea. You owe me more than 10% of the patent rights. And furthermore, there's a steamship leaving tomorrow for Europe, and I have written a letter in learned French to the Academy of Sciences in France. And this is considered the international arbiter in all these questions of priority and who gets credit. And in that letter, there's not a single mention of Dr. William Morton. And this starts this big gulf again between Jackson and Morton, which continues for decades. These two just couldn't agree and share credit. Mr. Eddy writes a letter to the Academy of Sciences of France on Dr. Morton's behalf. Mr. Bigelow, who I'd mentioned, was a junior faculty kind of watching all these events. He writes an article on inhalational anesthetics. He doesn't disclose that it's ether. In what we would call the New England Journal of Medicine in mid-November. It was actually a forerunner to that journal. His dad's a doctor, and he sends this on another steamship in mid-November that's heading to London with a cover letter saying that that drug indeed is ether. And this steamship arrives in London on, I believe the 16th. And Dr. Robert Liston, not Lister in germ theory several decades later, but Liston, Robert Liston's a respected surgeon in London. I've heard of him in another story. And he gets this letter on inhalational anesthetics on December 18th. And he reads the article that day, and the next day he gives a dental anesthetic, and the next day he fashions a glass inhaler, and the next day, December 21st, ether is used in London for an amputation. And at the end of this, Liston looks out at the audience where Warren had 2 months prior said, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." Liston looked out at the audience and said, "Gentlemen, this Yankee dodge beats mesmerism hollow." This discovery spreads up to the great medical center of Edinburgh and Glasgow before the end of the year. France is a little slower to pick up on this innovation. And Dr. Valpo, who I had quoted earlier in section 1, he at first politely declined to use ether. But when all these successful reports from the UK start coming over, he later graciously says, "This is a glorious conquest for humanity." The first mention of ether to appear in Lancet is the day after New Year's, 1847. And in that year of 1847, there's more than 200 letters and accounts and articles in Lancet about ether in anesthesia. And within months, it spreads as far as China and Australia. So, meanwhile, back in the U.S., it's early 1847. Morton has his patent, but the dentists around Boston don't care about any patent, and they're using ether left and right. And the war with Mexico is going on at this time. It was a 2-year war, and the U.S. government, which had granted Morton his patent, they're using ether without any regard to the patent in war. And this upsets Morton, and he goes to the government, and there must have been some precedent for this, but he goes to Congress, Washington, and he says, there should be an award of $100,000 for this discovery in exchange for my patent. And I get full sole credit. So that completes the gulf between Morton and Jackson. And that continues actually for decades. The House subcommittee is meeting on this, and they're leaning towards Morton. And the spring of 1847, and then a congressman says, well, it's not just Jackson and Morton. There's a third person involved in this. This Dennis Wells, Horace Wells, had been talking about anesthetics. Where does Wells surface at this time? It seems like too much of a coincidence to me, but he surfaces in Paris. And you just won't believe the last year of Dr. Wells's life. He shows up in Paris, and the Academy of Sciences of France is considering whether Jackson or Morton gets credit for this innovation. And when they find out Wells is in town, he's kind of hailed as a hero, and he's getting invited to parties, and they've asked him to be the dentist to the King of France, actually. That spring, when he returns to the U.S., he's putting his testimony together for his claim for this $100,000 prize in Washington. And, I don't think he quite was the personality to go up against these other people. And he was fighting he had kind of a fine line argument. He had used nitrous, and everything at this time is ether that had been successful, and he's arguing that he had the concept for inhalational anesthetics, and so it's a little more of a hard sell. To Morton, in the middle of this dispute, Morton's trying to get this $100,000 prize. Wells is just kind of a squeaky wheel, while it said that Charles Jackson just had the roar of a lion with what he was doing over in Paris. The Connecticut Assembly gives Wells sole credit that summer of 1847. But Wells, again, it's just a bizarre end. In the January of 1848, he leaves his family on a Monday. It's thought that he was inhaling, there was a drug that had returned from Europe and by chloroform, and apparently it had some addictive potential, and that Wells was using chloroform in the second half of 1847. But he leaves his family on a Monday and he moves from Hartford down to New York, and there's advertisements in the paper for him giving painless dentistry. It's kind of a convoluted story, but there's an incident on that Friday where he gets arrested for throwing sulfuric acid on a prostitute down in southern Manhattan, and they place him in the Tombs, which is a famous jail back then, and down by Wall Street. On Saturday morning, he's arraigned, and he spends the week in jail, and he's writing letters and things, and he's quite despondent. And again, the end of a bizarre story, but when they go in to check on Horace Wells on Monday morning in January of 1848, he's in the bathtub of his cell, and he's fashioned a drape, kind of a bandana over his face that's soaked with ether or chloroform, and he's anesthetized himself, and he's taken his shaving blade, and he's lacerated his femoral artery, and he's exsanguinated in the bathtub. So Horace Wells is dead in January of 1848. As this decade closes, again, Wells is dead. Morton is becoming a full-time lobbyist. And this is a lobbyist in the, it's kind of cigars and champagne and nice hotel room type lobbyist. And in Washington, Jackson's mostly defensive in the U.S. He's mostly pushing his case in Europe at the Academy of Sciences. But in the fall of there's a congressman from Connecticut who's pushing for this $100,000 prize on behalf of the widow of Horace Wells. But then in the fall of 1849, suddenly out of nowhere steps a fourth individual, and it's a physician, a very reticent doctor from rural Georgia by the name of Crawford Long. And it's thought that perhaps some friends said, there's $100,000 on the line, you better speak up. Well, it ends up that Dr. Long, in the spring of 1842, had used ether for several anesthetics. There was a man by the name of James Venable. He removed a soft tumor, a surface tumor from his neck, and then a month later he took another of these masses off the back of his neck. And that summer, I believe it was for a black boy, he did an toe amputation, but he never tells anybody about this. And again, he was in solo practice out in a rural area down south, and maybe he thought other people were doing this. So anyway, he's a fourth person in the claim for this prize from Congress. And then in 1850, the Academy of Sciences of France comes out with their verdict on who deserves credit for the discovery of anesthetics. It sounds perfectly reasonable to us, and it was perfectly reasonable to the rest of the world, but it was the worst thing for these two people, because they declared Charles Jackson and William Morton each to get 50% credit for anesthetics. And again, these two just couldn't meet in the middle and shake hands about this. They were completely different backgrounds and personalities and training, and it was a disappointment to them both that they never quite got over. Well, what happens to these people? Again, Wells is a suicide. Dr. Long, who I do not have a portrait of, and in my presentation he's really a small part of the story. He's the only one of these four that really has a good, successful life afterwards. He continues to practice medicine well in rural Georgia. He dies delivering a baby years later in the 1870s. He did ask a congressman to push his case, in 1853 or so. And also about that time, Dr. Jackson was down south on a surveying commission, and they spent a couple days together comparing notes. And Jackson was saying, you know, us two, we're physicians, and those other two were dentists. You know, we should get together, and we had the idea first. Well, Crawford Long simply just didn't want to do any deal making. He just said, you know, I was the first, and I just deserve some part in this story. And so he disappears from this ether controversy really quite gracefully. What happens to Dr. Morton? His story becomes a case of monomania, obsession, and if he had been a schemester, kind of a quick dollar, you know, scam artist, a confidence man early in his life, from here on out as a lobbyist, he's making his living off of just charity and largesse. He gets in trouble several times. In 1853, it's a colorful, he was caught faking some government documents to look like it came from a subcommittee. He got acquainted with a man who was the treasurer for a railroad out east who had embezzled like $250,000, and that individual loaned Morton at least $20,000 for lobbying purposes with the idea that they'd split the $100,000 prize once they won it. In 1852, the Jackson attorneys were going to present at Congress this dossier that I told you about earlier about all these legal problems and other problems that Morton had had early in his life in his teenage years. Morton's reply was attack, actually, and he said, bring it on. I'll answer all those questions city by city, date by date. And furthermore, Jackson's not the cleanest individual himself, and I've got some news on Jackson you'd be glad to hear. Well, Congress didn't want anything about this boxing match between Jackson and Morton, and so they said none of this is important. And this Morton continues on the campaign trail. It goes back to Washington in 1858. He presents it to Congress in 1861. His patent had worn out. It was a 14-year patent, and that had been expired in the year prior in 1860. And also the Civil War is starting at this time. Morton, he becomes less of a lobbyist now, and he's presenting his case more to the people. There's a lot of people who think that he didn't give so many anesthetics during the Civil War, that he'd just kind of show up at mess tents and get a free lunch, I guess. But one of the circulars he had, it's a pretty flowery speech, and perhaps it's true, we won't know, but he said, for myself, I am repaid for the anxiety and often wretchedness which I have experienced since I first discovered and introduced the anesthetic qualities of sulfuric ether, by the consciousness that I have thus been the instrument of averting pain from thousands and thousands of maimed and lacerated heroes during the Civil War. There was a young Harvard graduate from who was in the Civil War. He responded to that. He said, in that circular, Morton claims he was employed as the general, if not universal, administrator of chloroform and ether. He boasts of being omnipresent in the Army, particularly at Fredericksburg. I never heard of Morton's administering ether or chloroform while I was there, and he was in charge of a field hospital at Fredericksburg. This goes back to Congress in 1864. Morton's right there in the halls of Congress as the full House is going in to meet on this. And all you have to do is look out the windows of the Capitol, and there's military hospital tents out in the mall. And but within 5 minutes, the House dismisses Morton's claim. He still don't quit. And after the war, he's going on the tour. He's touring the country, presenting his case. And this is sometime later, you know, this is almost 20 years after the event. And it's said that younger people would hear his presentation and they'd say, boy, what a wonderful man. And older people would say, no, you know, you don't know these people. This was a bad event, and these were kind of bad characters. But the event that's thought to cost him his life was in the summer of 1868, June, I believe. The Atlantic Monthly, the most respected magazine in the country, really from his hometown of Boston. They had a 40-page article or so on who discovered anesthetics, and Morton's not even mentioned till page 5 or 6 or something. But their answer is that Jackson gets credit for discovering anesthetics. Morton is just has a difficult time with this. He goes to New York. The next month, there's a heat spell in New York, and he's confined to bed. He had a heat stroke of some kind. The doctors told him not to move. He was going to present his case to another magazine, Harper's, I believe, in New York. But he and his wife wanted to switch hotels, and the story goes that one evening they're in a carriage going through Central Park, and suddenly Morton jumps out of the carriage, and he jumps in the lake in Central Park and jumps out, and anyway, he's dead before he gets to the hospital in the summer of 1868. Morton is deceased at about my age. What happened to Dr. Jackson? Jackson outlives them all. Dr. Jackson lives until 1880. He spends the last 7 years of his life in an insane asylum of some kind in Boston. It actually sounds to me like he suffered an aphasic stroke. But after he dies, they find a 14-inch thick scrapbook on the ether controversy, and contained in it is things like awards, medals and things that he'd gotten from foreign dignitaries. And alongside that, he would have newspaper clippings of, say, Morton being accused of bribing a congressman and things. I'd like to close with a summary of this talk and just kind of my own personal thoughts about this, and have one last look at these four individuals. This is a chart that I came up with. It's called What is an Invention? I suppose it could say what is a discovery or what is an innovation. But this chart of inventions is my invention, and let me describe it a little bit. I've got our four major players on the left. And on top, what is an invention? To me, there's three factors. You've got to recognize that there's a problem, and then you've got to come up with an idea to fix that problem, and then you need to take action. And one point about this is no one's arguing for the problem that, screams of terror during an operation is good. But who really appreciated that the solution to that problem would change the world and have the effects that it did? That's what I mean by the problem. Who appreciated the problem and then took action? I give an X for full credit, and I give a half an X, a slash for partial credit, and then a 0 is nothing. No credit whatsoever. And if I was asked to reproduce this in a month, I might do this differently, but at this time, this is my assessment, and then I give credit in the right column. Dr. Long, first of all, is, and again in my presentation, I don't spend so much time with him. He's our resident doctor from rural Georgia. Maybe he did do this first, and that's all he claimed for, to his credit. I only give him 5% credit. Maybe he thought other doctors were doing this, but if he would have simply appreciated the problem, that's his difficulty. If he would have written other surgeons that had busier practices, he had gone to a very prominent medical school at the time, the University of Pennsylvania. If he would have dropped them a letter saying to explore this, I think we might be talking about Dr. Long having 98% of the credit. And so he only has himself, I think, to blame for not getting a bigger share of this story. The analogy to me is, suppose in my cul-de-sac of, there's about a dozen homes, and 20 years from now they find a solution to cancer, a cure to cancer. And what if I say, well, that's no big deal. Back in 2010, I was curing all the breast and colon cancer on my cul-de-sac. What role do I play in the history of the cure of cancer with Lance Armstrong and all the billions put into cancer research? I think that's an apt analogy, and I just don't play a big role in it. Next of all, let's look at Dr. Wells. Well, we've talked about Dr. Wells. Again, I'm quite sympathetic with him. I think he was a good person, and I think his life might have been better if he hadn't been involved in this. And perhaps that's true for all of these people. But I give Wells a lot of credit. Did Wells recognize the problem? Yes. When he went to Boston in what became known as the humbug affair, he thought he had a surgical painkiller. And he took that idea, that innovation, to the biggest stage he could have, the biggest stage in America, at Harvard. Did he have the idea? Certainly. It was Wells who was at Colton's nitrous oxide exhibition when he saw the man bleeding from his knee and the light bulb went off over his head about this. So he gets full credit for the idea. Action, I give him partial credit. You know, he kind of had the wrong drug and he didn't persist with this, and he got out of the whole activity of anesthetics and dentistry and trying to find a real solution to this afterwards, so only partial credit. I thought that nobody should get 50% credit, and I was going to give Morton 45% credit, but then I realized I had 2.5 marks here for Wells, but Wells gets lots of credit, 40%. Dr. Morton, I think Morton got the idea from Wells, even though he never gave him credit. He was Wells' student. He had been there on the humbug day, and I also think that he needed help from Jackson. So Morton gets no credit for the idea. Did he recognize this was a great thing? Yes. I think his behavior beforehand shows that he thought he was on the cusp of something great and what this meant. But what Morton mostly gets credit for is action. Morton brings this to the world in a big way. He performed very well that first month, and he put himself on the line. I think when he walked into the Ether Dome that day in October 1846, his heart was beating awfully fast. His wife wrote in her diary, I'm paraphrasing some, but if she said, you know, if this doesn't work, if the patient's too light, and he's going to be a bigger fool than Wells was, and if the patient's killed, this is manslaughter. And, you know, perhaps this would meant prison back then. So where there's guts, there's glory. And when the hour came due, Morton performed, and he publicized this. And one last thing about Morton, no hero of mine. But, you know, maybe you need guys like this. This couldn't have happened in Europe. Maybe you need kind of an entrepreneurial type person. You can't just have kind of laboratory rats. And the fact that he'd had a sort of damaged reputation, he was willing to put himself on the line again. What I'd like to finish with mostly is Dr. Jackson. I only give him 15%, and I'm a little disgusted, and the viewer can determine whether I'm fair or not. I'd like to finish with 3 little anecdotes. His official version, first of all, on this story comes out in 1861. He wrote a book called The Manual of Etherization. And his official story was, he claimed that in 1842 he was in his laboratory and he inhaled chlorine gas and he had injured his lungs. And kind of back at the Pneumatic Institution in Humphrey Davy's time, he had heard that if you inhale these gases, it'll be beneficial, it'll help your lungs. And he did so, and he realized the effects of the ether and that he got dizzy, and then he realized that he had found what he had long been in search of, and that was a surgical anesthetic. That's his official version of the story. And he said that he confided this in 1842 to this discovery to 12 of his friends, most of whom are gentlemen devoted to science. I'm quoting him. And this is right from his book, The Manual of Etherization. And some of them, physicians and dentists, I considered it safe so far as priority of discovery was concerned. It was my intention to revisit Europe and to bring out this discovery in the great hospitals of Paris, where I felt confident I should be treated with courtesy and fairness. But I was at that time actively engaged in the geological survey of the state of New Hampshire, and while my report was in press, was called upon to explore the wilderness of Lake Superior Land District for copper mines, so that I had not a month that could be spared for a voyage to Europe. Hence my procrastination. And so not only do I think I don't believe that version of the story in 1842, and I think that's masterful spin 15 years after the events to make that claim. I think it's condescending toward his colleagues of science in Boston. But even if you do believe it, by his own words, he did nothing for 4 years until he runs into Morton in 1846 or so with that idea. He divulged that idea to Morton 4 years later. He gets no credit for the problem. Recognizing this, for 4 years, people were in agony around the world while he was busy doing other things. And I think he probably was busy, but it's still no excuse, in my opinion. And he certainly is not taking action. Anecdote number 2 is, we've talked about the ether controversy. This was not the only controversy that Jackson was involved in. You may be surprised to hear it wasn't even the biggest, perhaps. He was mixed up in the priority of gun cotton and explosive. There was the description of digestion in the stomach he was involved in. Something about copper content up in Lake Superior. He was actually supported in that story, that he might have been the first to describe that. And we've talked about the ether controversy, of course, but perhaps even a bigger story is that involving telegraphy. He only went the one time to Europe when he finished his training from 1829 to 1832. And on that return boat ride in 1832, again, he's a man of science. He liked talking about science. So there's a story about a porpoise or a dolphin gets washed up on the deck, and he dissected it and showed the anatomy to people. But one night after dinner, you can just picture some men having some cigars around the table, and they were talking about science, and there'd been a report. Someone had come up with something about the resistance of the voltage doesn't drop over a course of a wire. And one of the men from England said, well, my brother lives 20 miles up the road in Wales. Why couldn't we use that knowledge then to send messages on the wire? Who's sitting at that dinner table but an artist who's only got one invention to his credit? He's primarily known as an artist, and that man's name is Samuel Morse, M-O-R-S-E, of Morse code fame. And he looks at Jackson and says, yeah, why couldn't we do that? And Jackson says, well, you could. Morse is completely captivated by this idea. He's asking Jackson about it on the remainder of that boat ride, ship ride. He's telling other passengers about it. He's talking to the captain about it. When he's met at the dock, he's telling his 3 brothers about this idea for telegraphy. He's making models. I don't know the story perfectly yet, but he's living in a tenant apartment in New York, and he really devotes his life to it. And I don't think it's until like 1845 or so that Congress gives the funds to build up, I believe it was between Baltimore and Washington, this first telegraph line. But in 1837, 5 years after that ship's passage, there's a couple men from Europe that are claiming to have this idea for telegraphy. And Samuel Morse writes his fellow passengers in what we might call a form letter. And he says, can you please attest to the fact that I was talking about telegraphy back in 1832? And one by one they answer this, including the ship's captain. Dr. Jackson gets this letter. He had only mentioned this idea of telegraphy. He'd talked to one person about it, a professor down at Yale in New Haven. He gets this letter and he replies to Samuel Morse, well, my dear friend, obviously that was a slip of the pen. We both know that telegraphy was entirely my idea. And Morse writes him back and says, I've repeatedly tried to look you up over the years since we got back to ask you about telegraphy, and you always were too busy in things. And again, I think he was busy. But I think this story, it takes some steam away from any credit he wanted in the ether controversy. Whenever there's an innovation, people want to jump up behind, and he was involved in several of these instances, several of these type events. Lastly, a very short anecdote. About a month after Ether Day, he and a Swiss geologist colleague were walking back from a conference or a dinner, and that Swiss colleague's geologist friend said, if on Ether Day, if that patient had died, if he'd been killed, would you still be claiming credit? And Dr. Jackson's reply was nothing, which I think that's a damning silence. And so In final summary, were these great men? No. Perhaps the stars lined up that, whenever there's fame and money and things involved, that these people just couldn't agree and meet in the center. But in the final analysis, Dr. Morton, Wells, Jackson, and Long, they all played a part in bringing us something wonderful, and for that we owe them a debt.